artist friends, I'm going to hit pause on this graphic for just a minute to explain the video ahead. I'm this week's Stencil School guest teacher for StencilGirl products. My lesson is just one of an amazing series created by MaryBeth to educate you on the unlimited possibilities of stencils. If you haven't caught any of the lessons in this series, I highly encourage you to head over to the StencilGirl YouTube channel linked below and check them out. Even though I've used stencils for more years than I can count, I'm always learning new things in this series. And following my lesson, there is an amazing group of additional guest teachers lined up, and there's one before mine as well. Be sure to watch the entire lesson and stay all the way to the end for a coupon code to grab my stencils. And without further ado, here's my lesson as recorded for StencilGirl's YouTube channel. Hello stencil friends, and welcome to my Stencil School lesson. My name is Nicole Watson, and I am a mixed media artist living in the Austin, Texas area. I am excited to show you a few ways that I create grungy background layers using the stencils that I designed for StencilGirl products. But first, let's go over the supplies. I'm using these super heavyweight index cards that I have double gessoed one way to the horizontal and vertical as I just showed you, my stencils, some foam applicators, India ink in sepia. I also grabbed black, but I didn't use it, Payne's Gray, Golden So Flats, Payne's Gray, and Titan Green Pale, some walnut ink, parchment spray paint, matte medium, and of course that gesso, a bunch of papers that I already created. You can see that video over on my YouTube channel, that link will be below, and then a bunch of scrap papers, some that already have like marks and paint on them, bits and pieces that I just could not bear to throw away, some papers that I used as palettes, and some larger papers that didn't have any paint on them. And I'm going to start off by creating my background ephemera layers on these cardstock note cards. I know I just went over that really quickly, but there will be a supply list linked below in the description box as well for your convenience. My backgrounds always consist of several different layers to create that grungy effect, and the first one after gessoing whatever substrate I'm using is adding a bunch of ephemera. I can add like a full sheet of ephemera so it's the same like I just did, or bits and pieces of ephemera so I have different handwritings and papers and fonts and different like graphics or whatever in the background. Sometimes I add already printed on or painted on papers like this one. This is my bean toast stencil, and I'm using this as the background of this card. I have other papers, like if you look at the very top right there, that was a palette paper that I used. Those are some of my favorite things to use for my backgrounds because you get some amazing paint blobs that you wouldn't normally get. The most important part about this process is not only to have fun, be creative, and not really care, because a lot of this is going to be covered up. It's just adding some amazing texture and starting point for your background, is to make sure that you have all of your background papers secure onto your substrate. In my case, it's these index cards with matte medium. So the matte medium is going to adhere it very tightly to your substrate, but it's also going to seal those layers up. We are going to do a lot of fun grungying up, using different layers, using lots of water, and sealing these papers down allows them to not be so porous that they'll soak all of that paint into them. We want the paint or other things that we use like the ink to really float on the surface and not sink right into it. So make sure that you have a really good layer of matte medium on top of your final product. Sometimes I even go over the card one last time just to make sure that I got enough matte medium on it. Here's a quick flip through of all that ephemera that I added to these cardstocks. I know I cut a lot of that process out of this video for time. However, I will have a full version of it over on my YouTube channel, and that's linked in the description box below. My next step is to add a bunch of gesso to these background layers. And you're thinking, didn't you already just add all of that really cool ephemera and now you're covering it up? Well, yes and no. This gesso serves several different purposes. It's going to kind of push away some of the marks on those ephemera pages that I maybe don't like as much. It's going to add, of course, some grunginess to this ephemera. It's going to add another texture. It's going to like add some contrast to the background, like some of these that just use one sheet on or one note. And in this one, for instance, it's really patchwork looking, so it's going to help to join all of those little bits and pieces together. I absolutely love the way white gesso interacts with old pages, just some quality, like some chalkiness that gesso has on the pages. And now I have all of those cards laid out on my desk after that first round dried to add just a little bit more. And once that's dry, we're going to get started on our next layer. Now it's time to grab our stencils and some paint and have a little bit more fun. So for this first technique, I'm just doing some really simple background stenciling. I'm grabbing my stencil, my applicator, my paint, in this case it's Payne's Gray, and I'm just going to simply stamp or paint through that stencil with my applicator. Super simple process. It looks really plain and not too grungy yet, but now we're going to add that grungy texture to it. I'm simply watering down some of the paint, grabbing my paintbrush, and kind of, as I call it, scruffing up that stenciling before it dries. There's kind of a delicate balance here. You don't want to start this process when your stenciling is too wet, but you don't want to wait too long until the stencil is too dry. So if you feel like your stenciling is just a little bit too wet, wait just maybe like 30 seconds or so. Maybe start in some of the stenciling that's not as thick, therefore it's a little bit more dry, and just use that paintbrush, that watered down paint, and just have a little fun adding that grungy nature to it. So we're going to do this 2 more times, with one with each of my stencils. First we used the letter stencil, now we're using the number stencil, and I'm using the exact same process. However, in this case, I just stamped or stenciled little bits of that stencil on, so it didn't completely cover the page, and I'm adding that grunginess. I'm going to kind of knock that card on my desk just to get some more drips and some more grunge to that page, and I'm just having fun. I decided I wanted to add just a little bit more stenciling. I'm adding it a little lighter here with a little bit lighter touch. I like kind of the dimension that gives to your stenciling, to stencil a little bit darker and stencil a little bit lighter, grunge it up, and just add those textural grungy layers to the page. Now we're going to grab my third typography stencil, and same process as the one that we just did, using just little bits of that stencil on my card here. Same process, stenciling it down, letting it dry just a tiny bit, and grunging up that stencil to add that last little bit of texture to these cards. So this is just a really quick and easy way to add grungy layers to your background with a typography stencil. We're going to have a few more ways coming up. They're maybe just a little bit more complicated, but they're super easy as well and have amazing grungy effects. For a couple of the techniques, we're going to have to do just a little bit more prep work on top of these cards. For this one, I need to add some more color and chaos to the background. So I'm using that watered down Payne's Gray just to add a little bit more puddling on top of that gesso and my bean toast stencil. And then I'm grabbing the walnut ink to do the same thing, adding just a little bit more chaos and color into that background. Again, much like that ephemera that we added to the back, don't worry about how this looks. We're going to cover a lot of it up. We're just adding a lot more chaos, texture, color, and interest, I guess would be the right word, to this layer. Our next prep work is to add some of this Payne's Gray ink to these cards. If you noticed in my flip through just a little bit ago, I left 2 cards completely blank without any ephemera on, and I'm going to use just ink on those, and then I have these 2 with just bits of ephemera on, and I'm going to use the ink as well. I'm having fun here and playing, dripping some of that ink onto the card, using water to allow it to drip, mopping up my background paper there with some of it, and just, I don't want the ink to completely cover the card. I just want to add a really cool like movement with this ink. This is the first layer of the ink. We're going to have to use the ink again to create a second layer of it after it dries, but so don't worry if you don't exactly love how this looks. Number 1, it's going to dry completely different. 2, we're going to add some more layers to it, of course. When I'm finished, I'm setting these to the side to dry along with that bean toast stencil that I just added all that texture on, and now I'm going to play a little bit more. So these cards have that pieced together paper from my palette paper that I use as I'm creating, and I rip it apart and put it on these cards, but it needs to be joined together. It's looking grungy, but it's like boring grungy. So I'm using my stencil to add texture here. I'm stenciling on top of those darker elements to kind of tone them down. I'm also allowing it to like float from element to element on this card so that it kind of brings it all together, and just adding that simple layer of stenciling not only adds interest to this background, but really kind of pulls it all together into one piece. For these cards, I'm stenciling with the Titan Green Pale, and now I've just watered down a little bit of it to add a little bit more grunge and texture to that background, just like we did on that first technique. So these cards are going to be ready to create on top of them. Whether you're going to add a photo, keep them as is, and add some more marks and writing on them. I'll have some ideas in the end of this video of what I have done on top of these cards. For this second one, I'm concentrating really on the big Payne's Gray blobs. I'm wanting to tone them down a little bit and add some texture to them. Adding the stenciling on top of them really helps pull this card together. Again, this is with the Titan Green Pale. If you're not familiar with my stencils, they were designed in a fun way. This font that I used is kind of upside down and backwards, but if you flip the stencil over, you'll have it kind of backwards and right way. I love the versatility that these two stencils have, that number one on the top left and this letters one that I'm using, because if you use it both either way, you have two completely different stencils. I'm adding just a little bit more Titan Green Pale around this to kind of pull all of it together. It's acting like a bridge between all of those big Payne's Gray blobs on the background. Now I'm grabbing the two cards that have lots of bits and pieces of ephemera on the front of them and adding some more layers to them for some more of that prep work. First, it's some of that watered down Payne's Gray. Next is going to be some walnut ink. For the walnut ink, I just grab my pipette, fill it up with some of the watered down walnut ink, and simply splash it on front of these cards. This is not only so much fun, but it's super grungy as well. Now you don't want to completely cover these cards up. We want a good balance between the blue Payne's Gray, the walnut ink, and the background layers, but we want a lot of good grungy chaos going on. Again, a lot of this will be covered up, but it's so important that you add these layers of interest for our next steps to these cards. And now that that bean toes card is dry, it's time to add my stenciling to it. I grabbed my numbers stencil here and some parchment spray paint. My first step is to spray paint one of these plain cards with that parchment, and then I'm going to flip it over and stamp it onto that bean toes card. And now you know why we wanted a lot of fun chaos in the background of that card, because we're stenciling / stamping over it with this stencil, and we're seeing the little bits and pieces of that Payne's Gray, walnut ink, the paper, the little bean toes coming through in those numbers. I'm spray painting on two different cards on that left there with that parchment because I need several sprays of it to stencil with. We're going to do more on those cards on the left in a minute, but this is probably one of my favorite stencil techniques to remember, that once you use it, especially with spray paint, to flip it over and stamp with it, because it is so cool. It's so grungy, it's so much fun, and so like not predicted because you get the outline of the stencil. I especially like to do this technique on top of deli paper and patty paper, and I have a video doing that over on my YouTube channel, which is linked below in my StencilGirl playlist. So I've paused for a little bit and let those dry, and now that those cards are completely dry, we're going to create some magical grunge on top of them. I discovered that this spray paint resists ink really well, so I love spraying this parchment down so it's kind of like a ghosting in the background, and putting this sepia ink on top of it. This stencil combined with the ink is creating the coolest grungy background layer. If you get too much, you can use a baby wipe and wipe it away. You can also start off very light, let it dry, see how you like it, and add another layer of that sepia ink as well. It's always easier to add it than to take it away when it's dry, because this is permanent when dry. I absolutely love this effect for a really cool grungy background. And because I have a lot of that sepia ink left over there on my palette to the right, I'm going to add a little bit of it to those first set of cards that we stenciled on. As I do this, you can see how adding just a little bit of that sepia ink really not only grunges up these cards a little bit more, but really brought out that stencil. And I'm doing the same on this other set of cards that we worked on. I'm using the sepia just a little bit to bring all of those elements together. Now that that first layer of Payne's Gray ink is dry, I'm just going to add a really simple second layer. I'm going to cover up some areas I'm not happy with. I'm going to darken some areas. I want a good contrast of light and darks for the next technique of stenciling that I'm going to add on top of them. Check out how amazing these cards look now that they're dry with that sepia ink and the parchment spray paint. I'm keeping one as is, and I'm going to continue grunging up the other one. For this one, I'm going to add an additional layer of stenciling with that Payne's Gray acrylic paint. I'm stenciling kind of light with a really light hand in just a few places around the card. When I'm finished, I'm going to allow it to dry just a tiny bit, then grab a baby wipe and kind of pull some of that paint off to give it a really ghosting look to that. I love the little subtle texture and grunginess that gives to my card. Next, I'm going to pick up the stencil, repeat the process. However, I am stamping or stenciling with an even lighter hand here, leaving a really kind of faint ghosting to my card. I have 3 layers of stenciling, all different techniques, adding to the grunginess of that card. So this is the only set of cards we're going to actually add a focal point to in my lesson. I grabbed my wonky leaf stencils, kind of rehearsed it a little bit there to figure out exactly where I wanted, put the mask in, and pulled the stencil up so I'd have the perfect placement. These are those cards that were kind of pieced together with ephemera in the background. I added more Payne's Gray and then a whole bunch of walnut ink to them. Now I'm using my foam applicator around that mask with the Payne's Gray paint to add it to my card front. If you're familiar with the game of Twister, I always think of my fingers on this as I am moving them around the mask. That is really like a Twister game on top of my stencil. Don't worry if your fingers get all twisted up and you don't get that stenciled perfectly. Remember, these are grungy card fronts. And because my stem didn't reach all the way to the bottom, I simply flipped my stencil over to extend that stem down my card. For this, you kind of have to work quickly and make sure you get that mask stenciled around really quickly so that the paint doesn't dry. And now we're grunging up that paint around the mask. We're going to allow it to be drippy. We're going to make it look a little grungy and kind of clean up any messes we made in the stenciling process. Now I'm repeating the process in the same way, except I'm using the stencil instead of the mask with the other half of my wonky leaf stencil. This is a little bit easier and you don't have to play Twister as much with your fingers, but again, don't worry if you don't get it stenciled perfectly because we are making grungy cards here. And because I don't want those leaves to look perfect, like they're just crisply stenciled on my card, I'm using some watered down paint, my paintbrush, and just moving that paint around a little bit. I'm also going to add some of it around on the background because I needed a little bit more of that Payne's Gray. One final step and layer to add to my bean toes card is to actually stencil through my stencil with the Payne's Gray ink. This is adding just another fun textural element, a little bit more interest. I'm concentrating on areas that I might not have stamped with that stencil as well, maybe where it got a little goopy and looks a little funny, it's going to disguise that, or parts of the background that just aren't as interesting. Once that is done, I'm going to add some of that watered down Payne's Gray, specifically mostly around the edges of the card and any other place that I feel just needs a little bit more shadow and shading. As I do this, you can see how it really brings out that stamped parchment, adds to the dramatic nature of this card, and just adds one great final grungy step. For me, and especially in my artwork, mixed media is all about the layers, especially when you're trying to create grungy ones. I want to add just one more interest around my wonky leaves by sketching around it with the Stabilo all graphite. Really loosely, really fun, and of course, very grungy. This technique is kind of fun because in order to finish up my grungy background layer, I had to add my focal point first. So my background layer was that ephemera, the gesso, the walnut ink, and the Payne's Gray Paint, and now it's also the Payne's Gray Paint around my focal point, and I'm finishing off with that stenciling. This stencil is adding the cool, grungy texture in my background. I'm stamping it mostly in that Payne's Gray Paint around my focal leaf. Some of it's going to go over the leaves. I'm going to kind of do this process really slowly, stencil a little bit, pick it up, look at it, see how it looks, see where I maybe need a little bit more stenciling, put the stencil back down, and just really mindfully add the stencil. Now I'm going to continue this process onto my second leaf. This one is going to be mostly outside of the leaf itself, adding that grungy texture to the background. Alright, now it's time for a little more grungy stencil magic on our last 4 cards. For these 2 cards with the Payne's Gray ink that have the ephemera on them, I'm stenciling on the front with that Titan Green Pale Golden So Flat. I'm mostly concentrating on where the darkest of that ink is, however, to add a little bit of fun texture to the background, I'm also stenciling it in several places outside of the ink. Same steps for both cards. And now for the 2 cards that I didn't put any ephemera on, I'm using that parchment spray paint, again spraying it mostly in the darkest of the ink, but a little outside the ink as well for that texture in the background. I'm also quickly off-spraying a little bit of splatters around that ink. I've let all 4 of those cards dry completely, and now we're adding some of that Sepia India ink magic to bring out that stencil, add a little bit more grunge and more interest to these cards. I'm using this Sepia India ink mostly watered down, but little parts I'll put it at full strength just to have some variance in the colors. I absolutely love how that stencil is textured in these layers of ink. And I'm going to continue this same process on the other 2 cards that I have the Payne's Gray ink on. And this wraps up my Stencil School lesson of how to create grungy background layers using stencils, specifically my typography ones. I want to thank you so much for joining me today for this lesson. Links to the supplies, to my YouTube channel, to all my social medias will be below in the description box. And be sure to tag me on social media if you use these techniques so I can see your beautiful artwork. And here's a flip through of all of the cards we made today. And since this lesson mostly focused on grungy background layers, I wanted to show you my iCads that use similar techniques. If you aren't familiar with iCAD, it's index card a day that usually runs in June and July. And this year I had a lot of people ask me how I created my layers on these iCads, so I thought this lesson would be a perfect way to share how I created these grungy backgrounds and show you my iCads that have a little bit more of a finishing touch on them. For some of them, I just added a simple stamp to the front, some mark making, some pencil work. For like these, I covered up a lot of the background to add my subject and just had a little bit of the stenciling peeking through. I hope this gives you just a few ideas of how you can finish off your cards. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have some fun today playing and creating grungy background layers. And here's that coupon code I promised you. Note it lasts 2 weeks until September 15th, and it works on all of my stencils, not just the ones that I used in this video lesson.